Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another exciting lecture by your favorite speaker, Dr. Ronald J. Brown. Our topic for today is the fascinating personality of Pierre Toussaint, who was one of the most famous early Africans in New York City. Our outline is a little bit of the background of African slavery in New York City. We all know about slavery in the rural South, but we don't know much about New York African slavery. Pierre Toussaint, a little bit about his background, and the role and the place of Catholics in Dutch and English and early independent United States. The problem of organizing an African American community, whether they were slaves or whether they were newly emancipated or following the abolition of slavery in New York, organizing a community. The legacy of Pierre Toussaint, and then a little bit about his Haitians in New York City. A lot of this material is covered in my book, Into the Soul of African American Harlem. And there you see 125th Street, the famous Apollo Theater. Well, of course, none of that existed during Pierre Toussaint's time, but he is still hailed as one of the early pioneers in organizing Africans in America. So let's get going on our visit. African slavery in New York. We don't think of New York as being a slave city or a slave state, but under the Dutch, it was a major slaveholding city. The Dutch established New Amsterdam in 1624. And as you can see from the map on the left, New Amsterdam was inside the city walls. The wall going up and down, north and south or east and west on the picture is today Wall Street. Well, the Dutch realized that if they were going to keep their massive land claim in North America, they would have to populate it. Well, there were very few Dutch people who wanted to migrate to the wilds of America, fight off Indians and wild animals, and possibly an English or Spanish or French invasion to seize the colony. So slaves were brought in from Africa. In 1655, the first slave auction was held, as you can see a drawing of it in the middle picture. It is believed that the first slaves were brought in as early as 1627, when the colony was only a couple of years old, because the Dutch needed manpower and to build a wall, build a fort, build farms in Long Island, New Jersey, and upstate New York. Now, under the Dutch, the slaves were not actually slaves. They were indentured servants, which means that they remained a possession of their master for about 7 years, and then they were given a somewhat limited but a degree of independence. This was the slave market at the foot of Wall Street. You see the Dutch buildings with the stepped facade. And this was built in 1711 after the English had taken over. And the English would bring slave ships from Africa. The English and Dutch in New York would take whatever slaves they wanted, and then the rest were simply shipped off to the southern colonies, because New Amsterdam had been made into an English colony called New York, and so it did a lively business with the other slave-holding cities further south. Under the English, the indentured servitude system of the Dutch was done away with. And the Africans no longer got their independence after 7 years. They remained slaves until they were either liberated or until they died. Their children became slaves at birth. Well, the famous 1730 New York Slave Code was drawn up because the slaves were clearly not happy with their status. They lived in a city. They were not in some isolated plantation in the rural areas, but they lived in the city. They spoke to other slaves. They got to know their masters. They took care of their masters' children. And so they were exposed to city life. Not that they could read newspapers, but sometimes a house slave would learn enough to read a basic newspaper article, and they knew what was happening in the broader world. So the 1730 Slave Code was in effect to clamp down on any slave who thought of revolting. And if they were guilty of confederating together to run away or cause damage to their master's property, they were whipped on the back, not exceeding 40 lashes for each offense. 1741, the famous Negro Plot, where a group of African slaves had decided that they were going to rise in revolt. Now, a lot of people say that this never happened, but actually it was simply a ploy by the English rulers to make sure that the Africans stayed in their place. Well, 17 slaves were hanged, 13 burned at the stake. By 1780, there were an estimated 10,000 African Americans, slaves, and those who had been freed in New York City, and another 340,000 throughout New York State, which included, of course, the 5 boroughs, which became New York City, as well as Long Island and upstate New York. So the situation of slaves was better than it was elsewhere because these were city slaves, and they were not picking cotton in Central Park. They were blacksmiths. They were cooks. They were servants in people's homes. They were carriage drivers. And so they were what we would call skilled or semi-skilled workers living in an urban environment. So that prompted them to periodically get organized, since they were not isolated somewhere, but they were living in the middle of a growing city. By the time of the American Revolution, some people say it's up to 25% of the population of New York City was slave. 40% of the families in New York City owned slaves, domestic slaves or whatever. The only city that had a higher proportion of slaves was Charleston, South Carolina. In fact, at the time of the Civil War, Africans outnumbered white people in South Carolina. And so we think of slavery down south, but it was very much a part of the fabric of New York City. During the American Revolution, many slaves fled their plantations and escaped to New York City because the English occupied New York City throughout the American Revolution. Beginning in 1776 to 1783, the English occupied New York. And part of their policy was to abolish slavery. And any African slave who escaped from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, or any other colony, if they got to New York City, they were freed. And furthermore, the British organized them into the famous Ethiopian Regiment, where they had raids across the Hudson River to New Jersey to areas known to have large numbers of slaves, expeditions to Long Island to liberate slaves, bring them to New York City. Well, in 1783, when the British were finally defeated and withdrew from New York, they took with them an estimated 3,000 liberated slaves, which they settled in Canada. Some were taken to Britain and others in British colonies like Jamaica. Pierre Toussaint entered this complex New York City slave situation. He was born in what is today the Republic of Haiti in June 27, 1766, so shortly before the American Revolution. And he was an urban slave. His master lived in the capital, Port-au-Prince, and he was, as you can see from the picture on the right, a sophisticated, literate person who spoke Haitian Creole, no doubt, but also spoke proper French and eventually learned England, traveled with his master to France, where he was exposed to French culture and civilization. The Bérard family owned him. We know that his mother's name was Ursula, but as often with slaves, they didn't have a family name, or the name would change depending on who owned them. They owned a well-to-do plantation. And on the right, you see the memoir of Pierre Toussaint, born a slave in San Domingo. This is the Boston version of 1854 after his death. So he was recognized by the Bérard family as a highly skilled, intelligent, hardworking slave, and so he was favored. He became a house slave and traveled with his master and was considered a very loyal slave. He was not out in the fields chopping down sugarcane or any other manual labor. So he was a house slave that lived in a house similar to this, a plantation mansion surrounded by palm trees, and of course was treated with a certain deference. House slaves, both in New York, the rural South, and Haiti, and other places where slavery was, a house slave was a preferred position. They were butlers, which meant you had to have clean hands, be well-dressed, wear shoes, speak proper French or English to the arriving guests. Women became cooks, where, of course, cleanliness and was very important, and they had to learn how to cook all of these special delights that either the French in Haiti or the American English people required. Waiters, cleaners, babysitters, wet nurse. Many white women didn't want to nurse their children, caused them to lose their figure. And so every plantation had a wet nurse. It was an African woman with very large breasts who was constantly nursing babies from the plantation. Horse tenders, carriage drivers, overseers, mechanics, disciplinarians. It was the slaves of a higher on the hierarchy, who usually meted out punishment to disobedient slaves. They became tailors and seamstresses. They didn't go to J.C. Penney and buy a ready-made shirt. So seamstresses for women and tailors for men was a highly coveted job. House slaves had more rights. Of course, they ate better, they lived better, they worked in the house of the slave owners, they cooked, cleaned, served meals, cared for kids, and were very much part of the family. Even the children born to house slaves were included in the family gatherings. Very often, the picture on the right, you see the little boy in the middle. I mean, probably the son of one of the slaves, but he would be a companion for the little boy on the left. And very often, a house slave learned how to read and write by joining in the private tutoring that was given to the son of the owner of the plantation. Well, Pierre Toussaint was recognized as a gifted kid. He was educated along with the white children of the family. He was trained as a house slave, dressed well. They returned to Paris and took Pierre Toussaint with him. Later, they went back to Haiti. Now, American Revolution 1776 inspired the Haitian Revolution of 1791, when the Haitian slaves rose in revolt against the French and slaughtered the French. Well, the Bérard family, along with Pierre, were able to escape to New York when they saw that the situation was getting out of hand. And so he arrived in New York in 1787. Well, the French were expelled from Haiti, and the father of Haiti, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, declared independence of Haiti. One of the early figures in the Haitian Revolution was Toussaint Louverture, and Pierre Toussaint adopted this name as his family name in honor of Toussaint Louverture, who ruled Haiti briefly from 1797 to 1802. Well, he arrived in New York with his sister, Rosalie, and 3 other slaves. He was apprenticed to a hairdresser. Very often the pictures show him holding a pair of scissors because he was an urban slave, so he was skilled. Other slaves in the city became carpenters, cooks, carriage drivers, tailors, seamstresses, and he was especially gifted in hair for both men and for women. And don't forget, back in the 1700s, you had no permanent curls. There was no hairspray. If it was a wet day and humid day, you constantly had to have your hair redone so that you could survive the day. As a slave to a well-to-do family, he had his entree into the homes of other well-to-do New Yorkers. Here we see the Alexander Hamilton Mansion as it looked in 1802. It still stands. On the right, you see one of the interior rooms. Well, highly skilled urban slaves were much sought after. And as a hairdresser, if the Hamiltons were having a big wedding or a big event, he had to be on call to make sure the women's hair was taken care of. And having lived in France, he also knew how to set it. He knew also how to deal with the lives of wealthy people. In 1807, he was given his freedom. He became what was called a free black in New York City. And this was a very important event because he remained with the Bérard family and took care of them even as a free man. Now, the Haitian Catholics were a tiny minority in New York City. Under the Dutch and under the English, until the American Revolution, Catholicism was illegal in New York. And everybody was afraid that you let the Catholics into New York, they'll link up with the French in Quebec or the Spanish in Florida and take over the colony, push these little 13 colonies huddled along the coast, push them into the sea, and the Catholic, French, and Spanish would eliminate the English presence in the colony. There was one priest, Father Steinmeier, we know his name now, who was a German Jesuit, who was in disguise as a farmer in New Jersey, and he would come to New York periodically, and he had managed to figure out who was Catholic. And so he would secretly have mass and can do his job as a priest. Well, even though the English had legalized Catholicism in Quebec in 1829 and in Great Britain in 1829, before that time, Catholics in Quebec, former French colony, in England, Ireland, Scotland, as well as the 13 colonies, were an oppressed minority. It was only following the American Revolution in 1787 that Catholics were legalized. Now, there were Catholics here. For example, St. Catarina Tekakwitha was a Mohawk Indian who converted to Catholicism and died as a very holy woman. And her statue, we see on the right, is on the main entrance to St. Patrick's Cathedral today. Well, following emancipation, the Catholics built their first church. On the left, we see the original St. Peter's Catholic Church of 1785. Well, that church was damaged and replaced with the current church, which we see today, a very classical Greek temple. And this was the church, St. Peter's, that Pierre Toussaint, the Bérard family, and the other couple of families that managed to survive in New York, this is where they worshiped. And he was noted as a very fervent, loyal Catholic. This is the plaque which is on the front of St. Peter's Church. Pierre Toussaint, Catholic Negro layman, member of the old St. Peter's Parish for 66 years. This plaque was put up in 1953. And the square outside, we see Barclay, but we see in front of the church, it is today the Pierre Toussaint Square, named after him. Well, St. Peter's was a multi-ethnic church. There were Indians from upstate New York who had been converted, moved to New York. First Spanish Catholics from Mexico and Spain, some German. Later on, the German and Irish came in large numbers. There were French Catholics, Quebec Catholics, African slaves from Haiti. And when St. Peter's was built, the bishop, the Archbishop of Mexico City, Núñez de Haro, donated the painting, which we see in the church today, of Jesus crucified above the main altar to recognize the Catholic presence in New York and the Mexican influence already in New York during the early Republic. Now, there was a problem with St. Peter's. These people had suffered under English oppression and had managed to survive. And so when people like Pierre Toussaint got his freedom, and other people like St. Elizabeth Ann Bailey Seton converted to Catholicism, these were educated people. They were not going to sit back and take orders from some bishop or even the Pope. They were going to run the church the way they wanted to. And they said, well, the United States is a democracy, so we don't take orders. We will hire our priest. If the priest is a lousy priest, we will fire him. And so St. Peter's was a very activist parish. This was called the trusteeship parish, where the bishop had a certain amount of power, but the parishioners had their own degree of power. Toussaint was a major benefactor to the St. Peter's School, which existed 1800 to 1817. He supported the establishment of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, and we see on the right, founded by Mother Mary Elizabeth Lang in Haiti. This was an African order of Catholic nuns, and he was a major supporter of African American Catholics. Well, the Catholic presence in New York was, of course, overshadowed by the Catholics of New Orleans and the other French cities of the Midwest. But the Catholics of New York took their mission in stride. The largest Catholic population was in Baltimore and in New Orleans, which became part of the United States. So Catholics were a growing presence. At the pictures, we see the Catholic Cathedral of New Orleans, and on the right, we see the early map of New Orleans perched along the Mississippi, and beautiful scenes of the outdoor shaded balconies of New Orleans. Pierre Toussaint married Mary Rose Juliette. We don't know when she was born, but they were married on August 5th in 1811 in the old St. Peter's Church. And we see from the way they are dressed that they were an upper class family. Pierre Toussaint, as an event planner, not just a hairdresser, ended up becoming very wealthy. As an independent freed slave, he had his own business. He hired people. He would be called for the fashionable weddings, even fashionable funerals and baptisms of all of the well-to-do families of New York. He spoke fluent French and was aware of everything that was going on in Paris from the point of view of high society. Well, the Irish started migrating early in the 1800s, and St. Peter's remained viciously multi-ethnic, viciously independent. So even when the Diocese of New York was established in 1808 and New York had its own bishop, who was, of course, Irish, the Irish built their own church. On the right, we see the old St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is on Mulberry Street in today's Chinatown. And on the left, we see the new cathedral being built during and after the Civil War. Well, the St. Peter's group, which was multi-ethnic, had no love for these Irish bishops who were running the place, and they maintained their multi-ethnic independence. Bishop Jean Dubois, a Frenchman, was the only New York bishop who was not Irish. He was called in to keep peace between the Catholics of St. Peter's and the Catholics of St. Patrick. Well, his reign of some 20 years was a disaster. The hostility between the multi-ethnic St. Peter's and the overwhelmingly Irish St. Patrick's got so bitter that when Bishop Dubois died in 1842, He insisted on having his body buried under the sidewalk leading into the front door of St. Patrick's, saying, "Now the Catholics can walk all over me in death as they did when I was still alive." Well, the African Americans, the few African American Catholics, gathered at St. Peter's. And gradually, in the early 1800s, following the American independence, New York became a main magnet for immigrants. New York was always a multi-ethnic city, even under the Dutch. There were the Dutch, but English were in New York, Scots, Irish, Germans, Native American Indians, slaves, and even the first Chinese began arriving as sailors in the early 1800s. Well, all of these ethnic groups started organizing themselves. Just like the Irish Catholics built St. Patrick's, it was more than a church. It was a school. It was a hospital. It was a community center. Germans did the same thing with their German Catholic, German Lutheran, and German Jewish churches and synagogues, organizing their people along ethnic lines. Well, slavery was abolished beginning in 1817, gradually abolished over the next 10 years. Various reforms, such as children born to slaves would no longer be slaves. Slaves could adopt their own family name. Slaves could legally get married. And so all kinds of reforms over the next 10 years ended with the final abolition of slavery, July 4th, 1827. So Pierre Toussaint was in New York, got his independence during this period, and he recounts his experiences in his autobiography. So gradual abolition was very important because it prepared the slaves for their freedom. Now, gradual children born, they got the right to marry. Various ones born after July 4th, 1799 were free. Men got the right to vote. They got the right to own property. All kinds of rights gradually were given to them. This is the opposite of the abolition of slavery following the American Civil War, that it was a sudden abolition. And so you had all these millions of slaves on plantations who couldn't read and write, spoke very poor English, had no urban skill, suddenly got their freedom and were totally unprepared for it. So the New York experience of the abolition of slavery should have served as a model for the abolition of slavery, but unfortunately, it did not. Well, the African Americans of New York, sort of, even before slavery was abolished, they began to organize. And of course, like every other immigrant group at the time, they organized around their houses of worship. For example, you had African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, which we see the current church on the right, 1796, James Varick. Abyssinian Baptist Church, beginning in Lower Manhattan and then moving up to its current location at the bottom on the left in Harlem. Well, these were more than just churches. They were social centers. The pastor knew how to read and write, negotiated with governments to get the right to build a church, to buy property, to hire teachers for the school. And so churches organized African Americans, just like houses of worship organized the immigrant masses flooding into the city. The African Free School was founded in 1787 by the New York Manumission Society, headed by Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. So New York City kids African-American kids were getting a basic education at a time when learning to read and write was largely forbidden among the slaves of the rural South. Juliette Toussaint, herself a well-educated woman, donated the site for the African Society of Mutual Relief. They assisted widows and orphans. It would pay burial expenses for its members. Don't forget that in colonial and early Republic United States, half of babies didn't live to 1 year old. And people died very often in their 40s and 50s. So a benevolent society was instrumental in every ethnic group in the city. The Colored Orphan Asylum was founded in 1836 by 3 Quakers, and it was at 5th Street and 43rd Street, main location, although back then it was still lying outside the city. Here again, orphan asylums. Every religious group had its own orphan asylum. The German Jewish, the Italian Catholic, because so many women died giving birth. Or in those days when women had a baby every 9 months and there was very little they could do to stop it, very often poor families would give their children to be educated by the orphan asylum of their particular racial, ethnic, or religious group. During the Haitian Revolution, Pierre Toussaint and other Haitians who had fled to the United States contributed to furthering the Haitian Revolution. So many African Americans managed to flee Haiti, showing up in cities like New Orleans and Baltimore and New York, that Pierre Toussaint was involved in creating a credit bureau to give them funds, employment, giving refuge to Catholic priests who were fleeing Haiti, and even trying to rescue people from Haiti. The Haitian Revolution was a very bloody and messy revolt with various African Haitian groups vying for control under Napoleon, trying to retake the colony and reestablish slavery. And so many refugees fled. So the African Americans, under the leadership of Pierre Toussaint and his wife Juliette, and a handful of other African slaves from Haiti, ended up establishing an African ethnic neighborhood where Africans were a significant number. They lived together in the same place because there was still a lot of racism from the whites against Africans, whether they were Haitian or African-American slaves. They built their houses of worship. They had their holidays and their weddings and their funerals and baptisms. They would have their Sunday after dinner food, their clothing stores. They would preserve their language, preserving French or today Chinese or Russian or whatever. So the legacy of Pierre Toussaint, well, he was declared venerable, which is the first step to becoming a saint. John Paul II declared him Venerable Pierre Toussaint, which was a major recognition for an African from the colonial period. When he died, he was buried in the crypt underneath St. Patrick's Cathedral. Well, St. Patrick's Cathedral was built during the Civil War, but when it was finished, his tomb and was transferred to the crypt underneath St. Patrick's Cathedral, the only African person to be buried there, and the only lay person, meaning not a bishop or a priest. And you see the plaque honoring him, Pierre Toussaint, servant of God, 1766, 1853. So he was highly honored by the Catholic Church, and to be buried in the crypt beside the bishops, cardinals, and leading clerics of New York City. Since 1978, there have been the annual Venerable Pierre Toussaint Awards dinner, which gives scholarships to African and African Americans with a big dinner with the leading African American Catholic bishops and priests, where they give out medals and honor the African contribution to the Catholic Church in America. African Christianity is a growing phenomenon. Various Catholic populations, Quebec remains predominantly Catholic, most of South America, countries of Western Europe and Eastern Europe, a growing Catholic population in Africa and Asia. And so Pierre Toussaint sort of inspired the vision that Catholicism was not a Western European institution, but it was an institution which welcomed and valued the contributions of the world. There are more Catholics in South America than there are in Europe these days. Cities in Africa have a growing Catholic population. People like Pierre Toussaint convinced people that they could become Catholic and remain loyal to their African or Asian or Latin American heritage and traditions. I spent time in Senegal, visiting the Catholic population in that predominantly Muslim country. Cameroon, largely, the southern half is largely Catholic since it was a former French colony. And so people like Pierre Toussaint show that Catholicism and Christianity in general is not an exclusively white religion, but it was global. The Collège Pierre Toussaint in Sacier, Haiti was opened in 2006. And here again, naming a Catholic school in Haiti after the Honorable, Venerable Pierre Toussaint. Here again, his name is widely recognized in Haiti as one of the children of Haiti who ended up being very successful. American-Haitian relations were not always good. In spite of Pierre Toussaint's success in America, when Haiti rose in revolt against the white population, the French occupiers, the slogan of the Haitian Revolution was "Coupe tête brûle caille," cut off their heads and burn down their houses. So every white person was forced out of Haiti or was slaughtered. Well, don't forget, when the Haitian Revolution around the year 1800 broke out, the United States had a huge population of millions of slaves. And so the United States viewed the Haitian Revolution as a danger, especially the southern states. They didn't want their slaves to hear about what the slaves in Haiti had done. So when the Civil War broke out, the southern slave states planned to annex North Mexico, make it slave, even take over Cuba, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Haiti, and even Central America, creating one giant Confederate States of America based on the major slaveholding areas of the Caribbean. And so the relations until the Civil War between the United States and Haiti were very bad. The United States opposed the Haitian Revolution. It was only in 1862 that President Lincoln recognized the independence of Haiti. Well, I spent a wonderful vacation in Haiti in January to early February 1999. Well, it is a vibrant country. You can look at the way they decorate their taxis and trucks. The marketplaces are absolutely a variety of colors and tropical fruits. And you can see the vast majority of the people are of African descent. Haiti had an earthquake shortly before I got there, and you see the Parliament building that had literally collapsed. Haiti has had a succession of revolutions, of wars, of uprisings, and as I speak today, Haiti is descending once again into gang violence and criminality. But yet, Haiti remains a unique city. The Hotel Olofsen on a hill overlooking the main drag of Haiti was the hangout for wealthy Europeans, and I met Americans and other people, and I met a lot of people who were doing research into the Haitian language, writing books and poetry inspired by Haiti. The gingerbread houses rival anything in San Francisco, of course, made of wood with balconies, little towers, gingerbread decorations around it. When you walk around Haiti, you are constantly overwhelmed by the beauty of the architecture. There are an estimated 1,138,000 Haitians in America, a growing community. Florida has the largest, New York has the second largest, Greater New York, some 335,000. Many go to France, many, an increasing number, are going to Mexico. And they have established their own newspapers. Here we see the Haitian Times in English, and there on the right we see Haiti Liberté in proper French. There are also broadcasts and stuff in Haitian Creole. Dictionaries are written to preserve the Haitian Creole, which is no longer considered a dialect, it is considered a language. It is the official language of Haiti. According to 1987, Haiti has two official languages, French and Creole, which means the Constitution is written in both languages. If you go to a courthouse, you can testify in either French or Creole. Also in the United States, there's a law that if you are arrested by the police, you go to the courthouse or you go to a hospital, you are entitled to have a representative who will translate into your language, which meant the police department, the hospitals, the courthouses have had to develop an entire lexicon of Haitian Creole for medical terminology. I mean, how do you say hip replacement in French, or how do you say it in Haitian Creole? Very often it's not the same. So many people say that these laws have really raised the level of Haitian Creole to a formal, technical, scientific language. Much the same has happened with Yiddish, where Yiddish was the regional dialects from Russia down to Bulgaria and Romania. And when the Jews from Eastern Europe arrived in New York, they found that everybody spoke a different kind of language. And so they had to unify the dialects into one standard Yiddish. The newspaper we see, the Vorwärts, in the Lower East Side, was instrumental in creating what we call today standard Yiddish. Yiddish Creole restaurants, Creole food stores, Creole churches, all are flourishing, part of the ethnic infrastructure that today the Chinese have, the Mexicans have, the Dominicans have, the Brazilians have, the Koreans have. They are in ethnic neighborhoods where Creole is spoken. You'll see the entire ethnic infrastructure. They brought along with them Haitian religions, Haitian voodoo. There you see Mama Lola, the voodoo priestess in Brooklyn. Well, most Haitians also practice Christianity of some form. They still remain loyal to their Haitian voodoo rituals and traditions, which are alive and well in New York. Haitian identity is growing, where we see the Little Haiti station in Brooklyn. You see books and movies, stained glass windows in African American churches celebrating Pierre Toussaint. And so you see signs in the subway or on trees in the Haitian language. Well, Pierre Toussaint is hailed by many as a role model for African Americans. Other people consider him an Uncle Pierre, as an Uncle Tom, in conforming too much to the prevailing white culture of New York, dressing like a white man, joining a Catholic church, whereas other people say you should speak Haitian Creole, not French. Stop going to the colonial Catholic Church and join a Haitian church, or even go back to voodoo. So people who support Haitian pride are sort of mixed on the image of Pierre Toussaint. Is he a little bit too Uncle Tomish and not enough pro-Haitian? Well, this is a controversy which remains today. So that brings us to an end. This is Ron Brown again, thanking you for joining me in exploring this often neglected chapter in African American history, where we tend to think of African Americans as being Southern slaves, but the New York contribution, the Haitian contribution, is very much a part of this African American experience. So if you have any questions or anything, please feel free to contact me. And this is my Gmail at ronbrownmedia@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. So thank you very much. This is Dr. Ronald Brown logging off. Bye-bye.